All right, solely for Jesse Bear in the Cube Talk Discord, we're making an audio rendition of the 100 Ornithopters in a Cube-Shaped Box video by Heuristic Studies on YouTube. It opens with Sam's usual Card Kingdom plug, and then it goes immediately into 16 minutes of cold open of Andy individually unsleeving ornithopters like craft singles and just eating them on camera. It's really quite gripping. After that, there's just a few photos of cards that have been altered, like an ominous zoom in on Klug's amazing piece, something with a possum, a great Snoopy. Then it's mostly just photos of Anthony holding strange objects at stranger angles. Wraps up with, some artsy-fartsy comments about what it means to play an art style as a game, and then finally ends with what are presumably either his patrons or his hit list. It's hard to tell. And then that's it.
Then he made a crazy noise after you said yes. This is the one reason I'm asking. Great. In that case, let's begin this very erudite episode of Lucky Paper Radio. My name is Andy. I'm here as always with my co-host, Anthony, the Mold Father Maddox. Congratulations on your successful Koji growth.
Thank you so much. I was a little unsure how it's going to go, as it always is with fatherhood. You don't know what you're going to end up with.
Tell us more about fatherhood and everything you know about it. I'm sure the many fathers listening would love to hear your opinion.
That's the other book, which I left upstairs.
Okay, sure.
We're not talking about that. But yeah, we were talking last week about my mold fermentation, my koji, and I don't think we should get too deep into it 2 weeks in a row, but it was successful. And I've got a couple different misos sitting on my counter that I made yesterday.
As far as I can tell, everyone loved Mold Talk. I saw no negative, why are you talking about fungus at the beginning of this episode about magic? There's even one guy that kind of cheekily, very often comments on YouTube the timestamp at which he considers the episode to begin. Just want to say, I don't mind that you're doing this, but everything that's in the show is in the show. It's all the podcast episodes.
I will say, somebody did call me out and say, on the fact that I kind of called out Rene Redzepi for using, the word garum as a neologism, and it's no, I get that garum is a thing that exists for thousands of years.
Yeah.
I'm saying what Rene Redzepi is making is not garum in that traditional sense. He's kind of ship of Theseus'd it, where he's replaced the enzyme and replaced the protein, and it's kind of this totally different thing, but
as the person who usually gets well actually on the podcast,
I know. I
took a little bit of delight in someone being like, actually, Anthony, garum's been made for thousands of years.
Yeah, I definitely was sitting there thinking, is this what Andy feels like every week, and I have to now correct all these people?
Yeah, most weeks.
No, but I appreciate the garum talk. It's interesting. I've got some literature recommendations, some videos to watch, and I'm looking forward to it.
This is an episode some people, I think, thought would never come. This is the second book club episode that we announced. I don't even want to know when. You know what? I don't want to know. I'm not going to look it up. And don't you listening look it up and tell me. But we announced this book club a while ago. It is the book Playing Oppression by Mary Flanagan and Michael Jakobsson. And it's been a long time in the making. And we have here, for our book review episode, Parker, Spin Doctor Lamascus.
Hey. So, one reason for the delay was there was a PhD in the middle at some point.
Yeah, Let's blame it on that.
Blame it on that.
Definitely
okay.
Not me taking a long time to read the book and not scheduling the episode.
We all took a long time.
Yeah, we all took a long time.
I was doing other
I took
stuff.
a long time to start reading it and then read it.
Anthony was growing mold. I smelled the mold yesterday.
I wasn't growing mold at this point, but
I smelled it yesterday. And thanks to the book you lent me, Nosedive by Harold McGee, which we are now reviewing. Andy, I hope you read it.
Yep, surprise coup.
I would be happy to talk about it. I think we should do it on the next book club episode. I genuinely do.
It is such a long book. It took me a year to read that. Oh, wait. I guess that's precedent.
now we've done it twice. Anyways, great book, Nosedive. Mold smelled great. I think you're on your way.
It smelled like apricots. It was crazy. The first day I walked down, and after it was going, and it was it smells like maybe an ice cream parlor is a stretch, but it smelled fruity. It was awesome.
Yeah, it did.
Next time, come over and smell the mold.
I do want to smell the mold. I haven't got a chance to quaff the fungi.
Quaff is usually drinking.
Yeah, know what that word means, does he?
I thought quaff was... Is there a word for when you
waft?
Is it waft?
Yeah, waft.
So is a quaff like a full drink or like a sip?
Like a chug.
A chug? A quaff is a chug?
I think so.
Well, today I learned. Just to be clear,
Yeah.
I love when you all correct me because it means that nobody will in the future.
Well,
so I
you're
want
one
you to
of-
correct every time you get a chance to correct me, I want you to take it.
One of today's lucky 10,000.
So, playing impression. What did everybody think?
Well, this was, I don't know that we said it, but this is the book club book for this.
Definitely said it. I'm glad you were checked out, though.
No, but it's also, this is Playing Oppression by Mary Flanagan and Mikael Jakobsson.
Definitely said that, too, but I'm
I don't
still,
think you did.
Still glad you were checked out.
All right,
He
listeners.
definitely did, but
let us know. Okay. Sorry.
No, it's fun. It's good. We like it.
why don't you start, Parker, with a little summary introduction to just what this book is all about?
I was surprised when I read this. I was expecting something different than what we got. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but I would describe this book as a history of imperialism told through board games, rather than what I expected going in, which was a book about game design and like how to design or something like that. It was, in other words, less maybe practical than I was expecting, but I'm not displeased. I enjoyed it nonetheless.
Yeah, I agree. I think there was a lot of just, a lot of the work that went into this book was just a ton of research. They just went and found a whole bunch of games, both games and played a lot of games that are actively being published today, but also games throughout history, and found games in archives and old libraries and records that they could find in private collections, and just sort of understand a little bit about what the history of games actually look like. And I thought that was interesting just from a historical perspective, even aside from sort of the thesis of the book or the like difficult topics that it was trying to tackle. Just getting some more history on games was very interesting. And then it did at the end sort of get into, it's very funny, the things that I would think of as like the epitome of games really is this sort of like smaller part of the game landscape, which is this like strategy game or what they call at some points the Eurogame sort of style. That's really what I think of when I think of games, and especially tabletop games and board games.
You're not a big Goose Game enjoyer?
Yeah, getting all that Goose Game context was, I think, really interesting and, yeah, valuable even outside, again, of that main message.
Yeah.
We should say this book was recommended by at least 2 or 3 listeners.
Or 8.
Like, a few people recommended it. I think, honestly, as a like direct response to our previous book club episode, in which we talked about The Beauty of Games by Frank Lance. And in that review, I expressed a little bit of criticism for what I felt was Frank's optimism about games, almost to the point of ignorance in terms of their actual impact in the real world. And I think a lot of people were like, if you want to talk more about the sort of more nuanced societal role that games play, and especially in a negative way, perhaps read Playing Oppression. And so I know DSB was at least one of the people who recommended this book. I'm sorry I don't remember the usernames or names of other people that recommended it, but multiple people did recommend it to us. I found this book really difficult to read, as we've kind of alluded to. I really like dry nonfiction. All my favorite books are dry nonfiction. My favorite book ever is A Pattern Language. It is 700 pages of people just describing how architecture and interior design works, and I read that thing cover to cover and just devoured it.
Full disclosure, I borrowed that book from you many months ago and have not managed to start yet. So.
That's fine. I mean, I don't take any, like, it doesn't have to be your favorite book. It's just to say that I am not the kind of person that's like, oh, I can't read a dry nonfiction book. I found this especially dry and kind of hard to get through. And ultimately, I think the book is good. I don't really have any major criticisms of the content. I didn't read anything and think I disagree with that, which was not true of The Beauty of Games. The Beauty of Games, there were a lot of things I was like, this feels wrong to me, or not nuanced in the way that I would like it to be nuanced. And I just want to say, too, in retrospect, we found out after the episode was recorded and released that Frank Lance did work for Zynga for years, which I think explains a lot of his sort of hand-waving at, you know, the potential bad roles that games can play. So anyway, just food for thought there.
I mean, yeah, I'll push back against that a little bit and say that, like, I'm much more on board with Frank Lance's perspective, and I feel like this is just sort of the flip side, this book, in the sense that, like, both start with the sort of core important thing they're trying to convey, which is that games are important, and games really affect the way that we think about things and the way that we develop both as individuals and as communities. And Frank is talking about sort of some of the most exciting moments of learning through games, and the sort of moments where he saw things in this like statistical perspective through learning poker that allowed him to think about other topics outside of games in his everyday life in a more powerful way. And Playing Oppression is very much about that same sort of thing, but leaning into some of the negatives about how the seeds of thinking in a lot of ways that are antisocial, or getting this colonial mindset, which can be really destructive. But in both cases, it's important that games are really fundamental to the way that we learn to think about stuff.
Yeah, just to make sure I've been really clear, I actually think that Frank Lance and I are probably almost agree almost lockstep about what we think about games. I believe games are beautiful. I believe they're important. I just felt that the book lacked a political context and like a social context that frankly is lacking from almost everything in our society. Like, I don't think that's a unique criticism of Frank Lance, that just didn't acknowledge the sort of role that the incentive structures that games are made within dramatically affects them. And that was my main criticism of it. But ultimately, like, I mostly agree with that book. And I think part of my criticism, if you go back and listen to that episode, was like, it felt to me like it was continually reiterating a thing that I was already bought into from like reading page 1, which is that games are beautiful and meaningful. So just to clarify, I did not hate the book. I don't think I disagree dramatically with Frank Lance. I just think that my worldview contains a more critical perspective on the incentive structures in which games are made than maybe Frank's does.
Yeah, I mean, it's also one book. You can't fit everything into a book.
No, I'm not
definitely
No,
have
I'm just
people
I'm
write in
about the
about
book.
this podcast and be like, you missed this really important thing. And it's like, yeah, well, we know about that. It's just we can't fit everything into every episode.
Yeah, but we're talking about the book. If people want to criticize an episode,
We're talking about a different book, actually.
We're talking about a different book.
Look, anyway, all to say, this is an answer to that. I didn't disagree with anything in here, which was not like how I felt about the beauty of games. I felt it was, I would describe it as like conceptually thin. I think there are actually not that many ideas this book communicates, but it is rich with examples. And I would say maybe half of the words in this book boil down to them describing the mechanics of a game, how a game works, what the turns look like, the actions players can take. And that to me is just my biggest critical perspective on this book is that I feel like it should have been formatted differently. I would have loved for this to have been a much shorter pamphlet with a very rich reference section of, if you want to see what all these examples of these things are, go do it, but here are the actual concepts we're trying to communicate, minus, paragraph after paragraph of explaining how this Goose game works and this kind of art and the mechanics of this Eurogame.
I'm so glad you said that, because that's exactly what I expected you to say, so I'm prepared with a rebuttal.
Great. I'm so glad.
I mean, I think it's worth, like they do on the Doughboys, which is, the podcast that we model ourselves after, they try to judge a restaurant for what it's trying to be, and I think we should do the same thing with this book and not judge it against all other books, but judge it, did it succeed in what it was trying to do. And it's an academic text. Like, this is a piece of academic research.
This felt like that.
This is not a novel that you're going to read and get to know the characters and fall in love with, or even like some of my favorite things, like we were just talking about Frostbite, which is all about the history of refrigeration. I was like, this is a page turner. Like, every part of this is like woven into a narrative. That's not what this is. This is meant to be written as an academic text to just give you some facts and then back it up with a lot of supportive evidence. And like, every chapter sort of ends with, and in conclusion, here we're going to summarize sort of what all these facts mean to us when we assemble them together. And you could view that as in a critical way and say, like, that makes this not great literature. It's like a little hokey.
No,
it's
I like that. I think that's good.
But yeah, I think that it just makes it really easy to read if you're willing to treat it as an academic text. And like, you could literally just go through and read that conclusion paragraph for like the last 2 pages of each chapter, and I think you would get basically that pamphlet length, more narrative, more opinionated, like drawing conclusions from the facts, and then go back and read all the supporting examples from the rest of the chapter. So I think that just that structure was intentional and not a failure.
Well, the one thing I'll push back on is, like, it absolutely is an academic text. And I've had some people respond to my criticism of the first book of it and say, it's meant to be academic. You're not supposed to, like, criticize it in this way. And it's like, okay, fine. Don't count my thing as a book review then. I just mean as a person who cares about media and communication. I don't think this information is best communicated in a book. I think that a lot of academic papers end up as papers, and they would be better as interactive data visualization. They'd be better as...
Make a game about games.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, it's just... Which, again, not saying, like, you messed up Michael Jakobsson and Mary Flanagan, just to say that, yeah, the world of academia has a, set of tools, and they apply that to every problem, and you get this out of it. And I'm just saying that as a person that consumes lots of media, I think this particular information could have been delivered in a much more compelling way if it was differently formatted, which, again, is not just an observation of why I found it hard to read, because it does read like a giant academic paper.
Yeah. Well, Parker, you actually have a lot of experience with academic texts. What are you feeling about that?
Well, I have written a couple of academic texts and edited some more, and sometimes in my own mind I think about this, the adjective I use is academic-y. Pun intended on the icky part of it, where it's not the prose that I would necessarily intend. If I were writing on Lucky Paper or writing for a mass audience, I do think you absolutely have to switch gears kind of and think about writing differently. There is a whole set of professional expectations around academic writing, a whole set of ethical expectations as well. Like, it's, one reason I think books are written like this is because you're meant to have absolute clarity on what's meant.
Right. No metaphor or
no
allegory that might be misinterpreted. Yeah.
Nothing that could be read one way or another. Absolute clarity. And when it comes to a topic like playing oppression deals with a lot of colonialism and history that is fraught and important, that kind of clarity really matters. But I do, your criticism is or comment is so valuable because this isn't exactly the kind of book I'd expect most people to read before bed, read for leisure. And I think it's worth noting that because our audience is not game scholars. We're just, and us included, I'm not a game scholar. We're just curious.
You're pretty close.
Yeah, an amateur, maybe. But we're here for something slightly different, which is we're Magic players, we're amateur game designers, we're people who care about thinking deeply about our hobby. So, or how can we translate the message of this book with that in mind? That's kind of where I'm approaching this.
Yeah, I mean, this is really just an observation of why I found it difficult to read, not to suggest that the authors should have reinvented communicating academic information for my purposes. But I do think it's just worth noting that all of the descriptions of how to play a board game will be so much better as a little video than a paragraph of just explaining how the resource system in Puerto Rico works. Just show it, not everything is best suited to a big block of text, but that's the delivery format they had available to them. So that's what we have.
Well, I wonder with that in mind, where should we start with the arguments of this book?
Well, I know you have said a couple times when we were talking about recording this episode that you feel like we are going to have to do a lot of work to get listeners to buy into the core conceit of this book.
Mm-hmm. And I
Say
know
more about that.
I know that because that's my experience with this book. I came to this book and a question in the back of my mind was, okay, this is a history of imperialism told through board games. So what? It's a game. What's the big deal? It's for fun. It's not meant to be.
Is that actually
a
your
super
attitude coming
serious
into
thing.
this, or are you hamming it up a little bit for podcast?
I'm hamming it up a
sizzle?
little bit, right?
Okay.
But also, I've talked to people who are, quite serious and people I trust, people whose politics I trust, and it's just I've never actually thought about engaging with a game in this way, and so I've primarily engaged with it as a leisure activity, and that's totally fine if that's where you're coming from. But I think the first point that this book makes is similar to Frank Lance, as you mentioned, Anthony, that games matter and games carry meaning. And so they give good examples of this. One example that I think of is as a kid, one way that I learned to define fairness was playing games on the playground, playing tag. And is it or is it not fair to, call that you're at a base that wasn't described as home base before the game started, or
that's Calvin ball. Now you're thinking,
yeah, if you poke or tickle your friend or something so that they let go of base and then tag them, is that fair or not? And this is a really silly example, but I also learned to play card games using a deck of spotter cards from World War II that had each card had an image of a plane, whether that was allied or enemy, and that carries a moral description. If you see one silhouette versus another, one of those people is coming to help you and one of those people is coming to bomb you. Right? So these are examples of yes, it is a leisure activity, but that doesn't mean it is empty of meaning. And that's kind of the starting assumption of this book for me.
Yeah, I mean, personally, I totally buy that, and I get how that would be difficult for a lot of people to sort of fold that into their worldview, but it's so easy to look at a game and be like, oh, it's just a game. It's not really important. It's not really something that we put a lot of weight on or think of in this sort of heady way. But to me, that in a way kind of justifies it having a lot of scrutiny pointed at it, because things that are so easy for us to take for granted are easily taken for granted because they are just fundamental to our worldview. And the fact that, we grew up playing games, we grew up playing Go Fish or Tag or whatever we had at home, Monopoly. Those are the ways that we learned about, I think fairness is a great example, but learned about the core concept of what does it mean to win something, or the established sort of setup that you are playing against people and the other people you're playing with are your opponents. These are just subtle things that work their way into how do we describe ourselves within the world. So I totally buy that idea that games and other things that just feel so trivial are actually extremely, extremely important and worth scrutinizing.
I have a question for both of you, and I'm curious in your answer to this question and in your take on what you think the author's answer to this question is. Do you believe that games are causally related to some of these issues we're talking about? I mean, the book uses the example of a lot of the propaganda the Third Reich used, basically. There was a lot of just incredible, cartoonishly hateful games that were released by the Nazi Party to basically spread propaganda, as they were, a propaganda machine? Or do you believe that the games are mostly just reflective of here's what society is, and it's reflected in this artifact that sort of captured this moment in time, this sentiment, but it wasn't propagating or spreading that message intentionally or otherwise?
I think it's absolutely both. It's sort of a feedback loop in the fact that in some cases these games were very intentionally designed to communicate a certain message or give people a certain perspective or, just like learn certain facts which have a lot of bias. I mean, I thought the section on trivia games was just like the most obvious compelling example where they were just like, yeah, we're going to give children this deck of flashcards that, they can play a game with. It just has facts that really paint people from other cultures as less than, and we as the imperialists being the strong people that are in control and morally right to be in control is like really, really explicit. But then I think that the people who played those games grow up, and that's the new generation that designs games, and they were influenced by those types of media and are going to go on to create types of media that then they think of as just totally normal because that's what they grew up with. I thought one example was really interesting of the game that was designed by a 12-year-old, and it's like, oh yeah, this is an extremely colonial message that you're sending through this game, but
you don't even know what colonialism is.
You don't really have a sophisticated understanding of this. You just think that this is normal. You just think that
this is how the world
going
works.
To Africa and collecting diamonds is the way the world works, and in some ways,
unfortunately, it is
not wrong
kind of,
from his perspective, from the perspective of the culture that he was raised in.
Yeah, I tend to think of games as being descriptive or like reflecting cultural values. That's not to say I exclusively think of them that way, but the trivia game you mentioned earlier, like I just want to make this really concrete. And so this trivia game is called Bricks of the Empire. It's from 1930. So we're talking about like the British Empire. The sun never sets on it right now. India is still a part of the territory. Parts of Africa and South America, again, part of the British Empire. And so this was a trivia game, kind of like I used in 5th grade to memorize the, capitals of the United States. And it was like, what's the capital of Britain? London. What's the population of London? However many 100,000. Who are Maoris? And this is an actual card from the game. Answer, natives of New Zealand, a copper-colored race, formerly clever and industrious, end quote.
Formerly clever and industrious.
It's really
such
explicitly horrible.
So there's multiple things going on there, and we can break it down a little bit as the authors of this book did. First of all, New Zealand is not what the Maoris call their own homeland. That's what the British call them. Mm-hmm. And so it assumes this like dominant relationship. Number 2, copper-colored?
Literally turn you into a commodity, a valuable commodity, like
and reducing, saying that
truly the objectification in the most like raw sense,
extreme
basically.
Objectification. The idea that the difference between you and a Maori is skin deep, and like the color of your skin determines the difference between you. A kind of insidious idea, I mean, extremely, that has it's done a lot of harm. And then this idea of formerly clever and industrious, which is crazy. Like, clever and industrious at like shepherding sheep or something is the subtext, and then
we have industry or whatever. So
we came along and showed that we were a dominant culture with bigger and better ideas. Certainly descriptive of the power balance at the time, right? Again, 1930, the British just own New Zealand in a lot of meaningful ways, and the process of colonialism being like extracting wealth from New Zealand and taking it to Britain, and that's how Britain has access to sugar and spices and tea and, Madras cloth and all of the commodities that they're extracting from other places. This is one way in which games can matter, and I think the structure of this book is to use examples like Bricks of the Empire and kind of trace that lineage from, I think, the 1800s or 1700s up to the present.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other big point of the book is there's a couple different levels that colonialism play into the aesthetics of games, and one is very superficial. It's like, here are these facts that are just presented in a way that is clearly trying to push an agenda and create an otherness in a group of people and say that we are not one community. And that also manifests in just a lot of the illustrations. So I would definitely recommend, if this sounds weird, like go look at some of the artifacts that they've collected and included images of in the book. And there are just like really explicit racist imagery in so many of these games. The other level is just in sort of the mechanics of the game, though, and the fact that when you're playing through a system, it again sort of like creates this value system in the way that you think about this like idea of winning a game, and how does that affect the way that you go forward and treat other experiences when you've been raised thinking about the idea of victory in a certain way, for example.
Should we talk about Goose games?
This is, I mean, I have a list here of like things I took away from the book that I feel like I will carry with me and not forget. And one of them is I never heard the archetype of a Goose game. Like, just I never knew that term, basically. Mm-hmm. And my first thing I thought is, holy crap, Untitled Goose Game was a reference to Goose Games, which is like basically like a Goose Game is like Candyland. It's a game where you don't actually have any autonomy. You are basically just rolling dice or casting lots and moving through a game board that then instructs you to do other things, right? It's just the most like basic chance that I would say is barely even a game, more of an activity, but that's, pedantry we don't have to get into.
I mean, the one that I think we grew up with, so people of our age and culture might be familiar with, is the Game of Life, where you're literally spinning a dice or spinning a spinner that's embedded in the board, tells you to move a certain number of paces, you draw cards that tell you to add something to your sort of character, but there's no agency. You're just doing what the random effects tell you to do.
Yeah, which is called a Goose Game based on this one famous game about a goose. And I don't know. I will never forget that, and that is like now part of my lexicon is just calling things Goose Games, which...
A couple things to mention. It's not fun, or like it's not what I think of as a fun game either.
No.
It's not what I would have even thought of as a game in the most like formal
It has all the
sense.
trappings of a game.
Right.
But
I think that's also an important sort of shift for me, a shift in perspective to be like, okay, like this is what games are, and like my definition of contemporary games is somewhat more novel than I realized.
But
certainly when it comes to like tracing the history the way this book was trying to do.
Right.
Yeah, like if they cared about the kind of thing maybe I think you thought you were going to get out of the book, Parker, more about like game mechanics, you would spend almost no time talking about Goose Games. You would simply say, for a long time, games sucked. And there was no agency and no autonomy, and you just kind of played out them to a logical conclusion. But I would say half the book talks about them because they were very popular for a huge period of time in which they overlapped with the most colonial periods of...
And we should talk about that context for a second, because one of the reasons for the Goose Game's popularity is that... this kind of coincided with the printing press and movable type and so on. And so you have widely available paper. You have people who are selling magazines and selling cheap paper goods. So the authors describe that many of these Goose Games were literally like you tear out a page of your magazine, and it
comes in the newspaper.
It comes in the newspaper, and this happened in Europe, yes, but also there were examples from Japan where these games were widely mass available, and so. Like the printers had an incentive to make something beautiful so that you'd like hire the printer for your next job. And also there was like this explicit like educational content. And so
in big fat air quotes, because it was all effectively propaganda basically.
Well, I mean, Game of Life teaches you how to be a like heteronormative mid-century successful American. You go to college, you get married and
acquire property.
When I played the Game of Life, you could get married to the same sex but I don't know if that was always possible.
You're
or if
so
I was
young. You're
abusing
so
it.
young, Parker.
Yeah,
you played woke Game of Life.
I played.
We
woke
didn't have
Game of
woke
Life.
edition when we were growing up.
It was still boring. Don't
You're
worry.
infected with the woke mind virus. Move back 6 spaces.
Woke or not, that game is boring. But like we were learning things, and in the same way, there was a Goose Game that was like, here's what happened during the French Revolution for all of you peasants in the French countryside in the late 1700s. Here's what's going on in the big city, and we'll teach you this through a Goose Game that we distributed in the newspaper, which is like crazy to think I might find out about current events by playing a Game of Life that I ripped out of the magazine. Right?
Yeah, I mean, it's almost extremely compelling in the way that you're describing. Maybe the best way to present the research of this book is not a book. They could have made a Goose Game out of it and been like,
huge Goose Game.
Let's make
Thousands
put
of
a bunch of these different experiences into examples into a Goose Game. And it's not necessarily important that you pick up on every single example, but you get a couple from sort of every time period. Could have actually been a very interesting way to kind of engage with this content. And so like just thinking through it from that perspective, it makes a lot of sense that people would kind of get this like almost choose your own adventure type experience from these games because of all the extra content that went along with the very basic activity. I'm going to roll dice and move to a random space, but everybody's going to have a slightly different story, even if it isn't choose your own adventure in the sense that you're making choices.
Yeah. That sounds like a fun project to make a Goose Game summarizing this book. If I were like teaching this in a college classroom, that would be the project for the assignment. That'd be fun. Another example just to like kind of drive home how prevalent these are. When the British Empire was like, hey, we need to educate our core citizens on what's going on over in India. let's make a Goose game. So this game is called The Noble Game of Elephant and Castle. It's from 1822. And yeah, the squares of the Goose Game depict different British colonies. And so again, as Anthony mentioned, you have these like racist depictions that are like, oh, look how exotic India is and Asia. And then as the player like moves across the spaces, they're learning about, oh, the white man is bringing medicine to India as if they never had it before. Or the savages are being educated by the white people. Again, like this is the view expressed by the game that a kid in London in 1822 would be learning as they play with their friends. And this is another way that games kind of operate on that cultural level.
On the sort of cultural relevance of the game, so you both sort of said that games are both descriptive and prescriptive of our like current culture. And I kept thinking while reading this book about the popular argument from the like late 90s, early 2000s about video games causing violence, especially violence amongst youth and an increase in school shootings specifically.
I think all the adults were right the whole time.
Do you?
I think so.
Say more about that.
I know that's all I've got, really. It's like I feel like I see a lot of violence and like tolerance to violence in our culture right now, and a lot of anger towards people that don't look exactly like you. And I'm like, yeah, a lot of people just grew up playing a lot of video games and being very isolated. And I think it's part of a bigger sort of effect that technology has had in being very isolating. But I think that video games is a big part of it.
May I rephrase? Are you saying that the parents may have overreacted when they said, "Oh, Magic the Gathering is Satanist because unholy strength"?
Oh yeah,
has a
no,
demon.
that part's crazy.
That part's crazy. But parents were kind of right when that argument that got taken too far does take seriously that games have cultural power.
Yes, definitely.
And carry meaning with them. That's really interesting.
And that Call of Duty literally prepares you to be willing to participate in the military. Absolutely, I think it does.
Right. And Call of Duty out of scope for this book, but there are...
Well, I'm not sure, though, because I was thinking about this the whole time, and for what it's worth, my perspective, I think that the idea that video games cause violence, like directly,
right,
is spurious and ill-informed. It's just wrong.
Yeah.
Like, we have a ton of violence and a lot of video games, and other countries also have a lot of video games, but no violence. Like, what a coincidence there. And the rise of video games actually kind of directly maps to a overall decrease in violence in America and the world over, for the most part. So in that sense, I see video game culture as a descriptive. We live in a violent society. It is not that video games are causing people to be school shooters. It is that gun availability mostly is causing people to be school shooters. If you look at the statistics and the actual things you can causally tie to increases in gun violence, turns out guns being present is one of the biggest actual things.
Right, but I do think that there's a huge thing. Like, so much of what I was thinking while reading this book is how games just have so much power in making things feel normal. And just the fact that you're playing a lot of games that have guns in them is just going to be like, yeah, guns are just a normal part of life.
Yeah,
and
so that's what I'm saying is I don't think that the argument of like, we have to take the video games away because our children are becoming school shooters, right? Like, that does not make sense to me because I don't believe those things are causally related. I do think that the video game industry, especially in America, is very reflective of a broad cultural value that just thinks guns are normal. And
right.
like, guns are normal and shooting people is fine. That's a normal thing that happens. The good guys are always shooting people. That's just what we do. And so I think that the actual impact is there, but much more insidious than being able to just say, take away the video games and we'll no longer have school shooters, which again, every reasonable study it's ever been conducted has proven that is actually not the case at all. There is no, direct tie. And there's like anecdotal things that are scary, right? This kind of basically all started with Columbine because the shooters were famously in love with Wolfenstein. It was one of their favorite games. And then more recently, Anders Breivik, I think, specifically said that Call of Duty helped him improve his target acquisition and shooting skills before his shooting in Norway. Like, there's anecdotal things that are scary, but it's that's not... Anecdote does not make sort of a causal relationship, and that I think it is a much more descriptive thing.
That's fair. And I mean, just to correct myself a little bit, I don't want to say anybody who has played a violent video game is instantly becomes a violent person. Of course, I've played violent video games. We all have. It is. I think that having a variety of experience, which can include, or maybe should include, some engagement with the acknowledgement that violence exists is reasonable. But I think it is more about the fact that it sets cultural norms, and I don't think that you can put it in a unidirectional way. I don't think you can just say that games are an artifact of culture and are descriptive of the culture. The culture is a feedback loop, and you can't take away any one part and just be like, oh, this part is just an artifact. It's just an externality or a thing that is produced by culture.
Mm-hmm.
All of that information just goes into the sort of reflection of what does a culture think is normal.
It does inform the future culture then, because, yes, people are growing up in the culture itself, for sure. Yeah, I guess it's just like, if you're going to try and change variables, I think you should look dozens of other places before let's ban the video games.
Yeah, that is absolutely true.
That's not actually the problem.
Yeah.
It is one of the many, 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 many numerous examples of the problem. But I've probably not said this in the show before. You've probably heard me say this a bunch, Anthony, because it's like one of the things I find most maddening about the world, which is just how normalized violence is. I had like a revelatory moment in my like early 20s, mid 20s, where I was like, oh, I hate violence in movies. I do not want to watch violence in movies, and the number of movies that you can watch that are not full of some kind of violence, there's so few. Like, that's just, our society is just completely normalized it in every way. I mean, I grew up playing a bunch of violent video games, as I'm sure most of us did, and just the fact that that is so normalized, and the thing I always think about is how taboo sex is. And it's like, it's totally fine to, on like network television at like, 6:30 p.m. have people like blowing the heads off of terrorists, but you may not show a nipple. If you show a nipple, it is forbidden. You are ruining our children by showing them a nipple. The fact that we ended up there is like still one of the things I have the hardest time like wrapping my head around about modern society. It's like that's a thing that's a normal thing almost every human being is going to engage in at some point through the course of their life, and is
most people
good.
will notice their nipples.
And it's good, and like there's nothing wrong with it at all, and yet that somehow we've arrived at a society where like that cannot be featured unless you are like NC-17, impossible, you can't look at this at all. But it's totally fine to just run somebody through with a bayonet, or disembowel somebody in a children's video game or whatever. So I find that just in crazy making, absolutely crazy making.
But I think is a really like tangible present day example of how these cultural artifacts do set norms. I wonder if we should segue to a different kind of norm being set in some of the games that Playing Oppression discusses in the early 1900s. And here I'm talking about some of the games that Germany was making before World War II. To me, these were some of the best examples in the book. 1890, there is a game published that the authors discuss called Germany's Colony Game. And obviously it was in German.
It's been translated,
But you go on a tour of the German colonies. This is really interesting. Young, often rich men would tour Europe when they reached adulthood. This was a kind of common thing, and the natural next step was, I'm a young German man. I've toured the Netherlands and France, and as part of reaching adulthood, why not visit some of the colonies? And if I can't afford to do that, maybe I'll dramatize that through playing a game. And so this was an element of how these games were played back then as well. It's not necessarily because the game itself is fun. It's like you're visiting an exotic culture. You're learning about the rest of the world. But the Germany Colony Game, the cover is crazy. And again, this is maybe one where the picture speaks louder than I can. The PDF is available online for free of this book. So,
It'll
maybe
be in the show notes. Yeah.
Use the reference here. But the black people on the cover of this game are shown in absolute caricature. A German kid in like a classic sailor outfit is like leading them by the hand.
He looks so much like a baby.
He looks like a baby.
As cherubic, I believe, in the actual text, and it is. He looks like a big baby.
Yeah.
It's also a caricature, to be fair, just a very different caricature, obviously.
This cherubic kid, and he's leading these black people by the hand. You can imagine like towards civilization almost, and the black people depicted are not standing up straight. Like they're cavemen.
Yeah, they're in the middle of that, image you've seen between monkey and man. They're like smack dab in the middle of that transition, basically.
Which is just insanely demeaning and dehumanizing to say like these people like needed a white kid to teach them how to stand up. What? Their features are illustrated almost goblin-like, almost mask-like. Like again, a dehumanizing thing. And I use that adjective goblin-like intentionally because I think I'd like to come back to that if we end up talking about magic in regards to this. But the black people are looking at the kid like he's Santa Claus, like he's the greatest thing they've ever seen. Oh, I can't believe we get to see a white kid or whatever. And then the authors rattle off like 5 more games like this. So
that's what most of the book is.
Right. It's an extremely, as prevalent as the way that, current US video games normalize violence, these games are normalizing, dehumanizing people who don't look like you. Yeah, it's really crazy. The authors also note that it's not just about the racist imagery. Because it's a game, we as players are participating in this. And so we're like, if the game has you educate black people or whatever, you are rehearsing actions that benefit the empire to some extent.
I think games are a much more visceral way to communicate a lot of emotions than any other medium. Like, scary video games are, I think, the scariest thing you can do because you are participating in your own horror, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's scarier than any scary movie or any scary book to be playing a scary game because you actually do have control and are still caught in this situation that is horrifying. And I think that element of agency and essentially then forcing people to use that agency to play out horrific acts is very visceral.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really important to state, even when, like, if you talk about a movie, it can be so much more graphic and so much more visual and visceral in a very different sense. And I think that just goes to sort of show how compelling the experience of playing a board game, where you might just be looking at a few frames, like one illustration on a page and reading some text, but you're having that imaginative experience of actually playing through it, which I think can inculcate people with a set of values in such a more powerful and insidious way. And I think that the sort of example I'm going to that to sort of highlight that power is if I had watched a movie that had some depictions in it that I didn't agree with anymore, it's pretty easy for me to go back and say, like, yeah, I watched that when I was a kid, I liked it, but now I realize there's some really inappropriate aspects to this movie and I'm going to divorce myself from it. But to say, oh, I played this game and now I realize it has these inappropriate depictions, like, it feels like it would be so much easier for you to go to being defensive about that, because it wasn't just something that you watched that was an artifact that was external to you. It was a thing that you were doing. Like, you participated in these actions in this little simulation that makes it very personal.
Yeah. And I think to your point, yeah, board games are way less sensorily engaging, perhaps, or like sensorily visceral than like a movie or something is. And in that way, I think it can actually feel way more tame because you're like, well, I'm just moving this little brick around.
I'm moving these little resources around the colonies.
And to me, that was like the part of the book I wish there was more of, and maybe I thought there might be more of, was talking about how these things are not just the skin of games, not just the flavor, the sort of texture of the games, the illustrations, the artwork, the narrative, but also like baked into the mechanics. And there is a chapter at the end of the book where they talk about new games that are sort of subverting the colonial paradigms that they've established as the norm elsewhere in the book. And I was really struck by, as I was reading it, I kept thinking to myself, well, that's just the same thing, but with a different skin. Like, the mechanics are still the same. And they acknowledge it when they talk about a specific game that is about trying to basically like grow a tree canopy. And you're like each growing different trees and competing for sunlight and water and resources. And it's like, yeah, you've reskinned it, but you still have this like competitive resource game against other players with agency, and you're trying to compete for limited resources and like box them out and remove them from the game space. Like, the mechanics are all still there, because obviously I think the natural thing to think about as you're reading this is like, how do you make games that resist this? And I felt there was not that many examples of games that truly, in like big mechanical ways, were different.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And they addressed it a little bit insofar as they were talking about the history of especially the Eurogames. That when do you have a rough timeline for that in mind, Parker?
We're talking post World War II.
Right,
so 20th century.
They became really popular. I mean, they mentioned that like Catan was like the Eurogame becoming mainstream. So it had a whole sort of history, especially within Germany, of these games, and they had that prize where they introduced to basically help stimulate the German board game market and like
Spiel des Jahres.
Yeah.
And it was interesting hearing about that specific prize and how every year game designers had a little bit of leeway to introduce something new, but they couldn't make anything that was too new. And I think that's part of the challenge, is like, how do you introduce something that is really counter to these mechanics that have baked in this kind of value system? Is you can only steer a train by a few degrees every sort of every moment, and it's like we can produce a new game that has a couple new mechanics or a new variation of mechanics, but it's the sort of cultural knowledge of how do games work and how do we play them just has a lot of momentum, I guess is the best way to put it. And I definitely experienced this when you sit down to play a game. Game players will know a lot of what's going on if it's a new
Especially
game,
Magic
like
players.
from the beginning.
That's mana.
It's like, okay, we
That's
understand the turn
an
structure.
instant.
Do I draw at the beginning of the turn, end of the turn? Like, you have language to talk about stuff. And if you were to do something that I think is truly as novel as the authors would love to see, you just need to start from scratch, basically. And that's going to take a long time to get there.
You are most likely from a colonial culture in which starting from scratch is not possible because you have your own brain that was grown in the culture in which you live. And so it's going to be very hard to do that.
Right. And I think that was a lot of what the book was trying to do, was not necessarily say, here's the solution, but
for sure,
here is the problem. And it is so insidious because it is hard to see because we are so stuck in it. Like, this is just the only reality we know.
So can we talk about Eschenspiel real quick? The Spiel des Jahres, which is the German game prize?
Yeah.
Why does that exist?
It's to stimulate the board game market.
Why in Germany? And that's, for me, the biggest aha moment of this, because in 1937, or for example, 1936, this is the game that you mentioned at the top. It's called Judenraus, which is German for Jews out. This is a game marketed to children in which children will play the game, and the mechanics are about deporting Jewish people on a train, kicking them out of town and deporting them. And the cartoon characters are like so happy to be going. And like, this is what you're talking about, what we're talking about, where mechanics can actually communicate values, and playing the game is a way of rehearsing a norm, a cultural norm. If you play this game with your friends and then you see this happening in real life in your town, you're like, oh, it's just like the game, no big deal. This is like not the only instance of a Nazi sympathetic game.
Certainly not, yeah.
The authors are careful to say that Judenraus specifically was not endorsed by the Nazi Party, but there
that was too far for the Nazis, or
they were
probably never got around to it.
They were trying to improve their image, and this was, as they were gaining power or whatever. But once they did, they were playing games. For example, I don't know that I can pronounce this. Jagd auf Kohlenklau, which is Hunt for Coal Theft. 1944. And that game mechanic is you are finding and ratting out whoever is hoarding coal from the rest of the German populace, because we're in a war. We need to
all resources are
leverage
for the war
all
effort.
of our resources. Speaking of which, war games were invented in Germany to a large extent. War games were about training the Prussian military class, the officer class, in strategy. And war games were employed in the start of World War I, like German battle plans. They were like, we can't actually invade anybody yet, so I guess we'll game it out on these Kriegspiels, they're called, war games.
Which I will insert here. Did you watch the video, Kriegspiel, about how Napoleon accidentally invented the war game?
I did not. I have seen, there's a YouTube channel called People Make Games, and they've done a thing about war games, but
this is a different one that somebody posted on the Cube Talk Discord a couple weeks ago, unrelated to this discussion at all. They were just like, hey, this is a great YouTube essay, and it is great. So I'll link that in the show notes, and it talks a lot more in depth about the history of specifically war games, which they only really kind of touch on very briefly in this book. They even mentioned, like, if you want more about war games, this has been studied extensively by other people, so go check that out. Everything you're saying is true, and also there's more nuance and I think interesting history in that video, which is really well produced. So
right.
I'll put that in the show notes.
So bringing us full circle, after the war, Germany is not only reckoning with their loss, but also the Holocaust, and
the German word for the collective guilt around the entire thing.
Kriegsschuld.
Yeah.
War guilt. Okay, and so you have a national culture that is like treating these past games with shame.
Yeah.
And they're like, okay, what are our kids going to do for fun now? What games are they going to play? Let's make peaceful games. Let's make games that aren't about conflict. We don't want to teach our kids how to do Judenraus Part 2 or whatever. That which is a noble impulse. But when you look at the Eschenspiel promoting innovation in games, and you're taking these stepwise changes from these colonialist games that we're talking about, that brings us up to a game like Catan, which won the Spiel des Jahres, and is evolved out of a culture that is like studiously avoiding the appearance of violence. This is why Eurogames, if you've spent any time in the gaming community, you're like, oh, Eurogame, peaceful, indirect conflict. We're competing over resources, not like actively harming other people's soldiers.
There's no attacks.
That's the Ameritrash section of stuff, is the dice rolls and the attacks. But Eurogames are peaceful, and that's something I heard as well. But reading this evolution from this war guild to the Eschenspiel, it's like, oh, we're still dealing with the same... Of course,
we're still in it. I mean, that's why guns are normalized. Like, that exact thread is why, all the things we talked about violence being normalized, that's why it is, because we won, and so violence must have been good. Must have been great.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great, powerful contrast, and it is really interesting the way it becomes manifest in these artifacts of our culture. But I think also to your point, Parker, is that even though these Eurogames are avoiding the appearance of violence, they're still all about resource management, and there is this hidden violence to that resource management.
Right.
By saying like, oh yeah, well, we're either just, we're in Settlers of Catan and we're going to this totally empty place where no one is here, and yet these resources are still being produced, and it's kind of just removing the idea of people that are actually doing the labor, and a lot of violence is being done towards them in reality.
Who's shepherding the sheep in Catan?
And who is the bandit anyway?
Right, and the land wasn't empty. There was always a bandit. He just lived in the desert where nobody cared, and the bandit pawn in the original versions of Catan was apparently black or brown.
Yeah.
And all they do is steal your stuff.
I mean, and I think that to me, there's almost this bigger takeaway, which is we can talk about the appearance of violence and the way that violence represents a huge part of our culture, but I think there's something also very insidious in this thinking about just resource management and accumulation of resources as being good. That is the thing that is really communicated by so many of these games, and that is absolutely something that I see. Again, it's like, is it descriptive or prescriptive? I think it's both. I think it's a feedback loop, and I think that sort of obsession with hoarding resources and accumulating resources is a major feature of our culture, and is reflected and reinforced by games.
That one feels so much more important to me, too, because not that obviously all the obvious violent theming is good. I obviously think that's bad, but I also think that many more people in polite society would agree that, it's not the greatest to, have people shooting each other or, stealing of land or whatever. But I think the vast majority of people in America would be like, of course you want to grow and get bigger and acquire as many resources as possible. Like, the sort of... And we'll say it, capitalism bad, but the sort of free market incentives of this is how you succeed, this is how you win, this is how you are good and righteous and moral is baked into things in a much more insidious way. That's the part that I was reading this book and thinking, like, before I even got to the last part of the book where they talk about games that maybe start to subvert these colonial themes. And again, I think they actually kind of showed there's very little mechanical innovation going on there, or relatively little compared to just like updating the flavor of the known mechanics. I was thinking the whole time, but like, how do you do that, right? Because I've played collaborative games, right? I mean, obviously, the first thing you do is just say, no longer are you playing against a player, but you're playing collaboratively against a sort of, unknown thing, right?
But even that, like, is there sticky territory where you're potentially just othering something else? It's like, oh, well, it's natural force.
You definitely could be, but like, I don't know, like, there's plenty of human effort that is not bad, right? Like, I think about what if there's a game that was, and again, not themed flavor-wise, but mechanically. Like, what are the mechanics of labor organizing? What are the mechanics of scientific progress, of knowledge acquisition? What are the mechanics of, different types of collaboration that does allow us to do things that are great? And I ran up against this thing over and over again, which is that I've played a lot of collaborative games, and the collaborative games I just generally find are not fun. You have a lot of like quarterbacking is this problem in like every collaborative game of all time. And I still sitting here as I say this, do not know if it's just a coincidence that, games are fun because they are provided outlet for human versus human conflict that is safe, right? Like, kind of like sports, right? Like, it is an outlet for us to like give into the worst parts of ourselves and like try and that's what makes it fun, right? Like, striving to win is an inherently fun thing, and so if we're all doing it collectively and the only like loser is some imagined foe that could be, humanized or not, then there's just not as much satisfaction in that. Or if it's just that I have grown up so deeply entrenched in this game culture that like there are lots of beautiful and interesting and deep and rewarding collaborative games out there that just nobody has made because there is so little precedent for it, and therefore it is so much harder to go against the grain of everything we know as being valuable, of being fun. Like, why is it rewarding to win? Because of to win solitarily, and to win over another human, and to triumph in a game of Magic over somebody by outwitting them, by having drafted better than them. Like, all of that sort of emotional satisfaction is so tied up in every cultural part of life that I don't know if games are just kind of inherently more fun when they're competitive, or if we haven't invented any of the good collaborative games because we live in a culture that's never going to do that.
Or the collaborative games exist but don't get popular on Steam or on social media.
Yeah. I mean, to go back to also what I was saying earlier about sort of like the experience of violence in games in small doses, it's like I think that is the same for also these kind of like capitalistic value systems that are embedded in games, where I think the real problem is when that becomes your only activity and you don't have a contrasting experience to be able to reflect on it critically. So I think Monopoly is a great example, which was initially designed as a game to teach about what happens when when everybody's motivation is hoard resources. Most people lose. One person wins, most people lose, and that's not a great way.
And it's also not fun, and it also takes 4.5 hours.
Yeah, and that's like a really bad way to run a society, is most people lose. That's valuable to have as an experience to see, like, here is the demonstration of a system that fails when you follow this set of rules.
But it turns out that when you play that game, the outcome is not that people think we should make a game where everybody wins. They think I want to win next time.
But you need some counter experience to then be able to look at that and say, like, yes, I might have learned something from that experience. I had fun with that experience, but that is not an experience that I want to carry forward into my value system. And I think that it's often difficult for us to have that perspective because we are only inundated with that one type of experience.
Monopoly, for what it's worth, like, as you joked about, it's not that fun in the first place.
Turned out.
So, like, it is kind of a goose game in the sense that you have to go in one direction around the thing, right? And you do
have agency, though.
You have agency over what you can buy, but, like, where you move is pure chance. And whether you land on your opponent's hotel or not, pure chance. So, I don't know. Like, maybe it's not that we're these, like, inherently, capitalist, like, greedy pigs or whatever and turn Monopoly into this. Maybe it's also an element of maybe some better sets of mechanics could improve the experience.
If only they tried to fix it and make a second version of Monopoly.
They did. Well,
I'm joking. There's like 800 versions of Monopoly.
No, but
most of them are just skins of regular Monopoly.
There is a game called Anti-Monopoly,
yes.
And a professor of economics, put this in the classroom. It didn't get a wide, commercial release or whatever, but maybe it is easier to tell that story of, monopolies are bad through a different set of game mechanics. Have y'all played any of the games that they mentioned as these good examples of towards something that moves
Not the new
past?
ones. I did take notes for a couple, and then I plan to seek them out specifically because I'm curious about them. But I don't think I had played any of the ones they had cited as... Oh, no, I'm sorry. They specifically talked about Wingspan. I've played Wingspan.
Yeah.
Which I think I've said on this podcast before. Not my favorite game mechanically, but a great example of the theming, and even the reason I think I don't like the game mechanically is because it doesn't have the same. It's a very minimal interaction with your opponents. It is kind of just everyone's playing solitaire and building their own engines,
right?
And it is not very competitive in the sense that most people do not play thinking about every option their opponent is going to have and trying to limit those options. They just play trying to optimize their own engine, which is why for me I don't find it to be a rewarding game. But it is a great example, I think, of how you can make something that people honestly, it feels like a modern Goose game in the sense that
I was going to say, it's it is really satisfying to just kind of play through the system and get to read these cards with information about birds on them. It's I like
beautiful
learning about
illustrations.
birds.
Yeah.
Me too. That's why I like it. And also, hilarious pun, Goose game, Wingspan. You get it. There's a card that's the Canada Goose.
Yeah.
And
I've also played Photosynthesis, which you mentioned with the little growing trees.
I have not played that one.
And I honestly, this is... Maybe it's similar. We are just in this game space playing a lot of Magic that we have very specific expectations for our games, but I found it had the same problem as a lot of resource games where there's not a lot of comeback mechanics. Once you have the biggest tree, you're just kind of taken over and your opponents can't really ever come back from that. So I don't know. It is a game where I really liked all the little props and the little trees you got to use, but the gameplay wasn't very satisfying.
The Wingspan example, I hadn't thought of it till you asked, but it's such a great example of what I want from Wingspan is more of this toxic cultural indoctrination we're talking about to be a better game.
Yeah.
In order for me to enjoy it, I want to feel
I want my birds to attack your birds and kill your birds.
I mean, Yeah, not flavorfully, but like I want to have more influence over my opponent's games. I want to feel like my decisions matter more and I have more control over like what happens to other players, so that when I win, if I win, I feel like I did it because of my wit and skill and not because I just happened onto the engine that I was going to draw the best pieces for. And don't get in the actually, you know what? Get in the comments about how great Wingspan is and how I'm wrong. I'm just not going to read any of it. That'll just boost all of our engagement. But it's funny because like I don't like that cultural subtext. I don't like the sort of inherently capitalist mechanics that are baked in of like out competing everybody and like winning in a like zero-sum war of attrition. But mechanically in a game, that's what I want. That's where I find games to be rewarding because it's so baked into me, I guess.
I do know people, I mean, like it might be a matter of personal taste, right? Like I know people who love Wingspan for that reason. Kennedy is one of them. Like
for what reason?
Adores Wingspan because it doesn't have a huge like player-to-player conflict.
Oh, for sure. I think that's why almost every. I mean, the illustrations are hugely responsible for the game being popular. But I was talking with a friend about this, and they were like, "Yeah, I mean, among the Wingspan players, you'll notice there's a lot more women, a lot more people that don't identify as like a cisgendered white man, and it's probably because the game is way less punishing because you can't just get run over if you know less about the game than somebody else because they can't just swoop in and take advantage of all your misplays the way they can in some other game." Hi, everybody. It's Andy from the editing booth. I just want to make sure that this point is not even remotely misconstrued. Listening back as I edit, I'm worried that this might sound like I'm insinuating that men are just the best at resource management games. They're just inherently good at games, and therefore everyone else seeks games where skill expression is not important. And that's not at all what I'm suggesting. What I'm actually suggesting is that I do think there is an element of masculinity, of maleness that is inherently tied up in these zero-sum PvP conflict, the kind of games where you are meant to outcompete other players for resources. And honestly, I feel like we could do a whole episode talking about how all of the stereotypical masculine tropes of men as providers, as defenders, as warriors influence games, and whether or not me and lots of other men out there are perhaps just finding an outlet for those societal pressures that is compatible with our politics and perception of our own gender. Anyway, I just want to make it clear, I'm not suggesting that men are on average better at Eurogames or these kind of resource management games, but I am suggesting they maybe are perhaps inherently drawn to them, or the sort of incentives and rewards baked into those games tickle the right part of their brain on account of the mountain of ridiculous expectations that our society levies on people based on their gender expression. Or also entirely possibly, I have no idea what I'm talking about, but that's at least what I think and am trying to express here. Anyway, back to the show. So yeah, I think that's why people love it. And it kind of has enough of the Goose Game trappings, of the beautiful illustrations, of the little factoids, of the enough just individual cards. It's the whole game is singleton, and there's like 1,000 cards. Like that is enough depth and like trappings to conceal what is otherwise, I think, mechanically not the most interesting game, so that you feel like it's new and interesting every time, even though you're kind of doing the same thing every time, no matter what.
Right. But I think that we have been critical of Wingspan in the past, and I think this is valuable to acknowledge that it's just not necessarily what you and I are looking for. And for many people, and maybe it should be something we are more willing to be open for, just like the experience of parallel play and like sitting down together and having like a way to twiddle our thumbs while we look at cool pictures of birds and learn some facts is an absolutely valuable social experience, even if it isn't a great game in this Eurogame, highly strategic, very interactive, but very peaceful sense.
Magic for sure makes you a huge GameStop. I think that's undisputed, and I'm always trying to combat that in my own self because I don't want to be a GameStop, but it does. Magic's great.
Have y'all played Spirit Island?
No, but that was one of the ones I was actually interested in most after reading the book.
So I played it like once in 2019, bounced off the rules. It was like, I don't know, I was younger. But after reading this, I actually downloaded it on Steam. There's like a digital port.
Okay.
And I caught a few games. This is a game where it is cooperative, yes, but is Flanagan and Jakobsson's example, one of their biggest examples of games that's like questioning this status quo that we've inherited. This is a game called a settler destruction game rather than a settler expansion game, right? Mm-hmm. That parallel is meant to be extremely obvious and pointed. The mechanic is that the players are working together as spirits of the island, hence the name, to expel invaders. And the invaders, playing this game in paper or like in physical, is really an interesting tactile experience. The invader pieces are all plastic. The blight that they bring with them to like poison the land, also plastic. The pieces of the native Dahan who live on the island and the pieces of the spirits who, are like the champions of the Dahan in some ways, are wooden. And so you have this very tactile contrast between the wooden natural pieces and the plastic invaders. The gameplay itself is extremely spiky edges, like war of attrition, min-maxing your dudes. It's like a hard game. You can pilot multiple spirits as one player, which is how I did it, but like then you can also do multiplayer. Really hard and like satisfying to win. So I think it scratches some of that magic itch. Din Rova Horror is, our friend Greg is a huge fan of this game and is also like a huge magic spike, right? So like it does scratch that same itch. I found it to be pretty fun. They make some criticisms of the game, but it certainly gives me a sense of hope or a sense of like excitement that games can deal with this in a more positive way.
That reminds me of another thing I was thinking about. I mentioned sort of the inherent tension in making like competitive games versus collaborative games, and how like so many things, at least that I know to be hallmarks of like strategic and deep, interesting games, are inherently competitive and kind of fall apart whenever it's collaborative. I think it's a similar sort of dynamic at play with games where you build something versus games where you have to protect something. Like my first thought was like, all right, so many games you start from nothing and you build something up, and that is inherently all about like growth of good, more better, make a line go up. It's sort of tied in with all those cultural values. I was like, why aren't there more games about protecting something? And it occurred to me that like it could be, again, that I'm just so steeped in this culture that I can't see any of the value in games that are doing this, or it could be that there are just very few games that don't have this built into it. But it does seem to be like mechanically there is something about building something means that you can inherently, as you progress through the game, slowly take on additional complexity, additional breadth, additional game pieces. Like it's a nice ramp up into like the complexity of that individual game itself. Whereas if you were playing a game that was about protecting and it's like, here's your whole thing. Here it is. We're going from 0 to 100. And as the game progresses, you will have to like try and protect this from some outside force or something. It does seem to me like that is inherently kind of a harder journey to take an average player on, of start from a full board versus start from an empty board and just start building things up, which I thought was interesting. That, again, an example of cultural bias so deeply embedded that there's just a bunch of amazing theoretical games about protecting something out there that haven't been made? Or is it an example where there just happens to be this coincidental overlap in what happens to be good for like a new player learning a game and for onboarding players, and also happens to represent this cultural value?
I think definitely the former. I think these games exist. They're just harder to find, or like aren't as popular at the LGS,
But I guess, is there a lack of popularity because of the cultural bias, or because they're just harder to get into because of the thing I've described about protecting a thing inherently? And also, like, how rewarding is protecting a thing versus building a thing?
Yeah, I mean,
you start with the thing. I've got it.
I think that is a huge cultural bias, that like stability and sustainability, like in a very literal sense, sustainability is not something that we value as a culture.
No,
like we don't
not
want
even a
things
little
to
bit.
just remain in a place where they can keep working the way they work. And I think that does make it less appealing, because it makes it less easy to tell the kinds of narratives that people will respond to and they'll resonate with people.
And I think that a lot of people would argue that's like human nature. They would argue that like it is human nature to be constantly striving, to be dissatisfied with the status quo, to like constantly want to improve and grow. I believe it's a cultural indoctrination of capitalism.
I think it's probably both, because we can look at human nature and it's been pretty consistently about growth and expansion and destruction for how many thousands of years?
Have you read A People's History of the United States by any chance?
No, I think maybe you've recommended that to me before.
Put that one on your list. The one part I'm thinking of right now as you're saying that is just, it talks a lot about the culture of Native Americans and how a lot of things that I think we take for granted as like just natural things that are like either biologically baked into us or like inevitable based on humanity were just not present. Like they were mostly matriarchal societies that like didn't have the kind of structural sexism that I think many people would say is just like, well, that happens everywhere. Like that's just going to happen based on the biology of the sexes. And it's like, actually, that wasn't a thing. They actually also didn't exploit the resources. They kind of lived in a symbiosis with them in a way that they were not, making species go extinct, but they were still providing for themselves. And like, I think it's interesting to think about how much that what you just said about how it's like it's so common and present in history is like, well, yeah, the history got the colonists won.
The cultures that are going to grow and expand are going to be the ones that are going to. They wrote all the history books,
and so that's why that might seem that way,
Write the history books, and I think that writing the history books is just one facet of this larger thing, which is shaping the world and creating the culture.
So I want to give y'all a little bit of game homework. One,
Dad.
and I guess our listeners as well. One is the games of a designer named Cole Wehrle. Werhle. So Cole Wehrle is most famously responsible for Root. This is a woodland tale of might and right, as the game describes it.
I've heard of this one before.
Actually, you've played it with me. I've played it with you. I've taught you.
I've in fact played it.
It is a asymmetrical strategy game, and the players are in conflict, but it is also a political simulation. One player is playing this dookie of I can't believe I said that.
I can't believe I have it on recording. This is
great. One player is playing this Marquess of cats, and it's all of the characters these cute woodland creatures, but then as you start playing the game, you realize it is vicious and competitive, and the cats are the industrialists who already have dominion over the forest and are trying to buzzsaw as many trees as they can to build up the army. Then you also have the Lords of the Sky, or whatever the faction is named, who are this aggressive dynastic monarchy that is aggressively expanding and invading the cat's territory. You have a raccoon who's an arms dealer and trying to profit off of both sides. And then you have one player who's playing they call it the Woodland Alliance, a populist rebellion who's trying to overthrow both political alternatives. What I'm saying is that it doesn't have to be a game where it's we've solved colonialism. That's too hard. I'm not
interested in that explicitly.
Because
also, at the very least, if you were to make a game about union organizing or whatever, it's going to have all this political baggage that people are going to hate it out of the gate because they just think that unions are bad. I'm way more interested in taking that concept of collaborative human effort towards a shared goal that is mutually beneficial and capturing that mechanically, and then making it about plants or animals or whatever.
So this game is really fun, and it's a way to get people to think about these political intricacies, a way to kind of open up a conversation, almost a conversation not just verbally but also through gameplay of what does this look like. Cole Wehrle has lately published a game called Molly House. A Molly House is a gathering place of queer and gender nonconforming people. It was a slang term for this gathering house in 1700s to 1800s Britain. And you can imagine the people who would gather at a Molly House were under a lot of suspicion and danger, right? This was not a great time to be queer.
Yeah, big found family vibes.
So the players are trying to collect the most interesting people at their Molly House or whatever. It is semi-collaborative. We're all trying to keep each other safe mutually. But then there's also this, if you are caught, you might get flipped, and the police might lean on you to rat out your fellow community members, right? So it's not a kind of Pollyanna depiction of the past, but it is instead a thoughtful engagement with what does cooperation look like. And yes, it's not always going to work out perfectly. So I do think, these games exist. They're not as hard to find as I might have thought. Once I started reading about the games in this book, in the last chapter of this book, I started visiting those websites and I looked at what those designers had made and kind of building out this map of games that are thoughtful about this kind of thing.
I'm really interested to play some of these and see how much I enjoy them on my metric of what I want out of a game. Because again, I think a lot of what I want out of a game is maybe inherently problematic. And so I'm curious to see if they can, as you say, scratch that itch of I feel like I've gotten to explore some deep strategy and self-expression in a way that is still rewarding in spite of not embracing the mechanics of colonialism or free market capitalism.
Mm-hmm. There are also some single-player games, video games that I think fill this. I know y'all aren't big video gamers, but one example would be a narrative art role-playing game called Citizen Sleeper. The sequel just came out, and the story is you are trying to survive like in the outer reaches of outer space. And the way you survive is by building relationships with your community. And like you can't do it by yourself. You have to build a network of mutual aid.
Is it fun though?
It is.
Okay, well, that's my question.
It's an 8-hour role-playing game. I mean, like, you know, that might not be what you sign up for. Like, I personally really like to short play time, really beautiful illustrations and good dialogue. But like, some people don't love a game that's clicking through a menu, and that's kind of what this is.
I think a lot of one-player games are... There's like a whole other genre here of like puzzle games, which I don't think for the most part have a lot of this baggage, but are about just solving a little intellectual puzzle. But it's hard to make that a game in the like PvP sense, I think a lot of times, and you end up in these other sort of like I feel like resource management is like the natural conclusion of puzzling, but for multiple people, and then it immediately comes along with all this baggage of fighting over limited resources and growing being inherently better. I feel like we're wrapping up here. I have one more thing I wanted to say, which is just another thing that's going to stick with me from the book. I'm glad you mentioned all the stuff about the nature of the games industry in Germany post-war, because that was also very revelatory for me of being like, oh, that's why Germany is like the center of board game history in a very meaningful way, and it's because they were essentially via cultural guilt forced to abandon a lot of the otherwise at the time most popular game themes and mechanics, and therefore had to reinvent the entire industry basically almost whole cloth, which is very interesting. And compared to, you know, the United States, wherever we were just like, yeah, war games are great. Let's print more little army guys and all play war games forever because war is good because we won and that we were good for it. That was really interesting. I also just thought that this book had like a 2-paragraph section where it described fascism as just colonialism but turned inward that I thought was very enlightening, where it's like, oh yes, that makes so much sense immediately, where you have an empire, you can imagine it organically growing, and then eventually you're like, now we're going to go conquer other lands, and part of conquering other lands is inherently othering people that have conflicting interests or that you see as obstacles to the growth of your like one true great nation. And then how easy is it to then just bring that ideology back to your home shores and be like, actually, some of these bad people are inside the borders of our country too. It's just a very natural progression that is a sort of description that will stick with me for sure. So I was appreciative of that idea for sure.
I've been thinking about where does magic fit in, you know, because like I've played all of, you know, most of these games. I did, you know, assign myself some homework and that was fun to experience that. But I still spend more hours playing Magic than any other game probably. And I think I've just been thinking about my friend Roja and her rusty cash box of goblins. I mentioned the goblin-like depictions that were extremely racist of, you know, black people. And like, if you read Magic early flavor text for orcs and goblins, it's extremely evident of genetic determinism. There's, let me see if I can pull it up.
I mean, I have a vivid memory of this kind of experience of goblins being aligned with a particular sort of morality when you and I, Andy, first started playing Dungeons and Dragons for a little bit, and
Our very first
every
one.
time we would meet a goblin, we'd be like, "Well, can we go talk to the goblin? Maybe he's like on our side. Maybe he's got hobbies." Maybe
Our poor GM was like, no, they're the bad guy.
They're
like, let me
goblin.
explain. You
They're
live
bad.
in a world where they are just inherently bad. And we're like, but what is that? I don't get it.
It was difficult for us to.
There's also a deep
Get that.
history of anti-Semitism in goblin depictions for sure that has been...
The greedy Gringotts
Yeah,
goblins
for sure.
who own the bank in Harry Potter,
For example.
What? There's something problematic about Harry Potter?
yeah.
First I've heard of
Okay,
it.
so Ironclaw orcs, I think printed in alpha, flavor text on the original printing. Quote, generations of genetic weeding have given rise to the deviously cowardly Ironclaw clan. To say that orcs in general are vicious, depraved, and ignoble does not do justice to the Ironclaw.
So much flavor text.
It's a lot of flavor text.
No
but-
mechanics on that card, just a vanilla creature?
no, sorry, it can't block creatures with power 2 or greater. So it's
Okay.
also
I was just wondering how they fit all that
a
flavor text in
mechanic
there.
of cowardice, right?
Sure.
And it's saying like people who look like this have been genetically weeded to be cowardly, which, you know, like there is an element of genetic determinism in Magic. Goblins are cannon fodder. Goblin Grenade plays on that joke.
They're stupid, they're foolish, they're literally ammunition to be fired at your opponent.
Right. Their lives are expendable, you know? And this cube in my local play group, Rusty Cashbox of Goblins, is a celebration of goblins. And it's still Magic, like no rules changes, but it's leaning into the silliness of goblins and kind of celebrating them. And so as you're playing Magic and you're like assembling this absolute crew of misfits, goblin spy, goblin No,
Name a
keeper
goblin.
of
Name a goblin.
my goblin is keeper of Kukas, which is just like this crazy like
Keeper of Kukas is so dumb.
it's really dumb. And you're
Is
just
Kukas in the cube?
no,
Kukas is not in the cube, but Keeper of Kukas is?
yeah,
Oh, well,
and so like it.
Roja continues to inspire.
I know it doesn't have to be a serious exploration or like you don't have to like stop playing Magic or stop playing Magic the way you like. Like that's not the point. The point is we can celebrate things in Magic that are off kilter, off this like that set a different, that steer the train by a couple of degrees, like you mentioned, of like celebrating something different that's not just all powerful wizards, instead celebrating the little guys that the wizards ignore. So yeah, that was just something that was on the mind and something I'm going to be carrying with me after this book.
I think the whole thing for me has always been about like awareness. Like I think the important thing is awareness of how these things are insidiously baked into everything we engage with. And I think an awareness of that means that you can engage with it and not be turned and not have your mind sort of stolen by the depictions or portrayals or themes of the thing that you're playing or reading or watching. It's like in the same way that I don't think, playing a violent video game makes you violent or whatever. It's like you just have to be aware that like, wow, it sure sucks that this is the only option available to me, and that, yeah, all of the money and resources and game development talent went into making a bunch of violent games because that's what our cultural value is. But these are good games now because of all that effort that went into making them. So I think it's always about that self-awareness for me personally. I have been playing this game recently called Polytopia. A friend wanted to play an asynchronous mobile game with me, and they suggested Wingspan, and I said, don't think I would really get a lot of joy out of playing asynchronous Wingspan. I'm sorry, it's probably not for me. We talked about other alternatives, your classic Word with Friends. They were like, what about chess? And I was like, oh boy, chess is the kind of thing where I don't want to do it well, and I also don't like doing things not well, so we talked about a bunch of options. Nothing made sense, so I just straight up Googled, like, good asynchronous multiplayer games for iPhone, right? And I found Polytopia. I've never played a Civilization game. I'm told that it is basically a like distillation of Civilization down to like a very simple turn-based strategy game where you start on a map that is a mixed combination of your sort of okay, everyone chooses what's called a tribe at the beginning. I'm bearing the lead. You choose a tribe, and the tribes are just all very broad depictions of Vikings, Native Americans, ancient Greeks, Japanese people, Chinese people. It's so bluntly and like uncritically skinned as like just, colonialism. It's just colonialism, the game, basically. You start on a map that is like half your tiles, half your opponent's tiles. Every tribe has their own unique densities of how their map spawns, but every map is then unique, and then you compete to like expand across the map and capture cities and grow resources and eventually destroy your opponent, right? And my first thought when I found this game was like, wow, this is awful. Just the vibes are bad. Like,
and now you've been playing it for a while and you're like, maybe this is okay.
Yeah, and now I think actually this is good. No, what I want so badly is like the same game, but just skinned differently. Like, why do you have to have just like different races and people across time and history represented as the tribes here? Why can't they be creative and like interesting and, exploring new creative space? Why do I have to capture the cities? Like, it would be so easy to just say, like, instead of being a tribe that's, capturing a map, you're like spreading. There was a game I used to play on an emulator from Super Nintendo that was called Ogre Battle Tactics March of the Black Queen, and it had very similar mechanics, but I thought it had a brilliant sort of adjustment to the flavor, which was that instead of capturing a city, you were liberating them. They were all basically under the thrall of like a violent empire, and you would come and bring the knowledge and a will to like resist this evil empire, and the city would become liberated. And I'm like, this game could be exactly the same mechanically. And I should say, Polytopia has some amazing things. I think it is mechanically brilliant. It is free to play with no ads, and they don't like put the good, pieces behind a paywall. You can buy more stuff, of course, but even if you buy everything, I think it's like $20. It's not like it's an infinity hole of just like losing money. It's like one of the rare examples of how you can actually make a software product and sell it for like a moral and like reasonable model, and not everything has to be like, microtransactions like pinging you to death. So it has a lot of great things. Why not just give it like better theming where you're liberating cities instead of capturing them, and instead of being these broad racist stereotypes, the tribes are actually just unique creative designs. And then I had the question for myself of like, how much does that matter? Like, if the game was reskinned, how much would it actually affect everything we've talked about, the ways in which games matter? How much would it actually affect the descriptive or prescriptive nature of people's perception of it?
Yeah, but I think that's one of the core points in this book is that even if you just reskin it, the mechanics are still there, and the mechanics still matter. And if you tell yourself a different story about, oh, I'm actually liberating these people, and I'm bringing them into civilization, like, you can tell those narratives while still committing violence. And I think that solves the very overt discomfort of having these themes
of them
shoved
literally
in your face.
being little straw huts, and then you capture them and they become like a beautiful shining city.
Yeah, but
it's pretty messed up.
I think that it doesn't you know all about Lord of the Rings. It doesn't remove the foundation of Sauron's tower or whatever.
Yeah.
Like those mechanics still contain a lot of the same value systems that are maybe more deeply problematic.
Anyway, Polytopia is a great game if you care about the mechanics, and it's an awful game if you care about the flavor. All right, well, thus concludes episode 2 of the Lucky Paper Radio Book Club, Playing Oppression, The Legacy of Conquest and Empire in Colonialist Board Games by Mary Flanagan and Mikael Jakobsson.
I guess I would just say that, I don't think this book solves the problem, obviously. Like, they're just trying to understand the scope and scale and texture of these kinds of insidious ideas that are baked into the artifacts of our culture, and I don't think we're solving anything either, especially as, 3 white dudes talking into microphones. But I do think, like, just having that level of awareness and, like, continuing to have a conversation, and I think the more that we are willing to be introspective about the kinds of activities we're doing and the media that we're engaging with, that's, like, a first step that is critical.
Yeah, it's just about using your brain and being curious about how to be kinder and gentler and, more effective citizens and thinkers, more effective thinkers too.
Well said.
So Nosedive next? It took you a year. How long did it take you to read
7 months. So it'll take you 2 months.
Nosedive, I think, is a very powerful book, and I think that Parker, we were talking about this last night, and you highlighted, I think, something that's really valuable about it is that it talks about science, but from this really intimate, personal starting point of just, you smelled something, what's that all about? And then, like, bringing in the history and context. It does have nothing to do with games, so I don't think we should talk about it. It's also
I think we can talk about whatever we want.
It's extremely long. It's like, it's a tome.
I was thinking about the design of everyday things, which is a big, like...
I think you and I probably both read that in college, which...
I do. I have a copy of it upstairs.
Somewhere. Hey, cool. We've all read it then.
I'm down for that.
If you have another idea for the book club, sound off in the comments. Let us know what you want to hear us chit-chat about. I would love to get better about doing this, call it 3 to 4 times a year. Would be great.
Mm-hmm.
I like these episodes. I think this was a great conversation. I value both of your contributions and mine's. This is going to sound self-effacing. I love being the dumb guy in the room. I genuinely think it makes me smarter, and you two are so smart. I love to be the dumb guy. It's great. It's a good role for me to play.
Well, we love it too. I don't know.
I'd have no one else as my dumb guy.
I love talking to you guys. I don't care.
All right. That's fine. You weren't supposed to deny it or anything. All right. On that bombshell, that's the end of this episode of Lucky Paper Radio.
You're not the dumb guy.
Nope,
I'm clearly the dumb guy.
Nope. That's the end of this episode of Lucky Paper Radio. All of the music for this show is produced by DJ James Nasty. All the magic cards that we didn't discuss. Did we mention a single magic card?
Yes.
Yes. Ironclaw Orcs.
Great. That'll have one card on the cards mentioned page. If we got the card text of that card wrong, we did it to bait you for engagement.
Or the flavor text. If we got the flavor text wrong, that's important.
Was
that
it not
matters.
actually printed in alpha? Sound off in the comments and correct Parker. That will help boost this on all the various social media platforms. This podcast is produced by thinking really hard about playing oppression and speaking into microphones about it. Anthony and Parker, thank you for the gift of book club and for the gift of friendship. I did that in the opposite order.
And thanks, Sadie, for laying on my foot this entire recording.
Is that sarcastic?
No,
Is
awesome.
it a delight to have a dog laying on your foot? It's
Yeah.
so good.
And thank you for the gift of in-person wingspan. We need to figure out what that bird was we saw.
Uh-huh, yeah.
And then collect it for our own. Put it in our own
capper.
little
No, and then we
aviary.
can just appreciate it. Just look at it from a distance.
It lives in the tree.